So, welcome everybody to the first ever Whiskey Wash podcast. And we're trying something new here. We're trying a new format. I have so many conversations with people that are fantastic. It just seems a shame that these conversations are never really shared. So today we've got a fantastic guest from the Isle of Harris Distillery, which I know if you're listening in America, you might not necessarily have heard of it too much. But in the UK, they've been making fantastic whiskey and fantastic gin for around 10 years now. And well, Simon, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself to the listeners?
Yes. Good morning, Mark. It's a pleasure to be your guinea pig here on this in this new venture. So thanks for inviting me. So yeah, my name's Simon Erlanger. I'm the managing director of the Isle of Harris Distillery, and I think I'm proud to say this is my 40th year in the whiskey industry. So I think veteran is probably the polite way of putting it. And have been involved with the Harris project since it was an idea roughly 15 years ago.
So let's be frank here. The Isle of Harris, most people who have a rough geography of Scotland, you'll know where Islay is. It's somewhere off the left between Scotland and Ireland. Shetland, we know, is right at the top. So where do you sit then? Where's your distillery?
Well, get on a plane from Islay, go due north, and off to the left a bit, and you'll find a group of islands called the Outer Hebrides. So Islay is in the Inner Hebrides, like the Isle of Skye, for example. And the Outer Hebrides is a long chain of islands which consists of the Isle of Lewis, the Isle of Harris, and the Isles of North Uist and South Uist and Barra. And next stop, if you're heading northwest from Scotland, is Nova Scotia.
So you're right at the top on that west coast then, pretty much.
Absolutely. So way out in the Atlantic Ocean and, facing the full brunt of all the weather that comes over from the States.
So
sorry.
I was going to say it's a pretty easy place to build a distillery then. You've got all your materials on site and...
Yeah, well, there was a reason probably that no one's done it before. I mean, apart from the fact that there's no arable land on Harris, it's tough enough to graze sheep and have a few cattle and grow some potatoes, let alone barley for malting. So there's a good reason why there's never been a distillery. Plus, as you quite rightly say, the cost of doing anything on an island like that is astronomical. And the weather isn't necessarily in your favor. And by the way, the islands are made up of 3-billion-year-old rock. So it's the oldest rock on the planet, more or less. And, diamond drill bits usually break when they're trying to build housing or warehousing or distilleries on that island. So it's, it's not for the faint of heart.
So if you can then, can you take us back to the start? Because the distillery is only about 10 years old or so, isn't it? But the idea must have been around slightly longer than 10 years. So where did it all start?
Yeah, the idea is fascinating. It's not mine. It was a really, really interesting gentleman called Anderson Bakewell, who's actually an Anglo-American musicologist by trade.
Oh, wow.
Yep. And grew up in St. Louis in Missouri. Fell in love with the Isle of Harris in his 20s. He's now in his late 70s. And spent a lot of time on Harris over the last 50 years. And in that time, saw the population halve and watched young people drift away as they couldn't find employment. And, the bright lights of Glasgow and Edinburgh would attract them. And as like as not, they couldn't come back. And there's this incredible sense of community in Harris. Young people actually don't generally want to leave. They want to stay. And so I think Anderson just wanted to do something to try to reverse this decades of population decline. And as you heard, he's not from our industry. He doesn't call himself a businessman, but he is somebody with an incredibly long-term perspective. And he would walk the hills of Harris and he would drink the water from the burn, which is the most delicious, softest water in Scotland. And he would wonder if there was some way in which you could capture the essence of the island in a bottle and send it out to the world, and therefore bring the Isle of Harris to the attention of the wider universe. Because even in Scotland, I would say 95% of the people I speak to have never been to Harris, and most of them don't even know where it is, even people living here in Scotland.
So how easy is it to get to off the mainland then? Is it a ferry? You mentioned a flight from Islay?
Well, yesterday I did a round trip from Edinburgh to Harris. I walked to the railway station, I got a taxi to the airport. I flew from Edinburgh to Stornoway, which is in the Isle of Lewis. I have a motorbike at the airport, so I got on my Royal Enfield and rode down through Lewis, over the mountains, into Harris, down to the distillery. I then did the reverse later on the afternoon, got a plane from Stornoway to Glasgow, got a train back from Glasgow to Edinburgh, and then walked home. So that's one way of doing it, but the more romantic way is to drive. And it's about 10 hours door to door.
Wow.
Including the ferry. So that's probably why it's so unspoiled. And despite having some of the most beautiful beaches in the world that, rival the Caribbean, on a summer's day in July, you'll have 2 miles of beach, and a crowded one will have about 10 people on it.
And I guess
it's like that.
So is that part of the plan then? There's this amazing landscape, there's this amazing geography and water source, but the prospects for people wanting to remain on the island are difficult. So a distillery would be that source of the center of the community almost.
That was exactly the idea. And not only could it directly provide employment, and in a variety of disciplines as well, because we're a microcosm of any business. We have hospitality, we have marketing, we have engineering, we have production, logistics, we have finance, administration, human resources. So we do a little bit of everything. And so there's lots of variety of opportunity for jobs. But as importantly, this vision was to act as a catalyst, so that if we were successful and if we encourage more people to the island, then that might act as a catalyst for other tourism-related industries, food and drink producers. So, a beautiful example is, since we set up the distillery at the ferry terminal where the boat comes in from the Isle of Skye, since we established it, they've now set up a marina. So
wow.
Encouraging marine tourism. So you can pull up your boat, walk off the boat literally into the distillery, pick up your gin, and then sail away again. So that was the idea. And, we think we've been pretty successful. I mean, we actually have about 75,000 people come through our doors every year.
That's a phenomenal number, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it's huge for a distillery, again, particularly such a remote one.
And is that people sort of going on a pilgrimage to Harris, or have you almost become the reason to go to Harris then now?
Yeah, we don't know, of course, because we don't ask everyone who walks through the door. But there is certainly there was some gin related tourism for the first few years. Now that we have a whiskey, there's whiskey related tourism as well. We are proud founder members of the Hebridean Whiskey Trail, which now encompasses 7 Hebridean whiskey distilleries, and a lot of them are new ones now, like ourselves. So that's also putting the Hebrides on the map, if you like, for whiskey production.
Yeah. And this is sort of fascinating because you've mentioned the G word a few times, gin, because if gin is a big thing in the UK. I don't know how big it is in the US, but drinking gin in the UK is a big thing. Gin and tonic, I'd argue that it's much bigger than drinking whiskey, simply because you've got the mixer element with it. Mm. Now, the obvious thing that people might be wondering is why did you start off producing gin when you're a whiskey? Or do you classify yourself as a whiskey distillery, or you're a distillery that produces gin and whiskey?
Yeah. It's a very, very good question. We've always said from the beginning, we're a whiskey distillery that produces gin. If you go to the distillery, you'll see 1/10 of the space is made up of gin production. 90% is made up of whiskey production. But in the early years, you have to wait. And one thing we were absolutely adamant about, we were not going to rush our whiskey out into the market before it was ready. So technically, 3 years and a day, you're allowed to bottle your whiskey and sell it. We knew that that was very risky and that we needed to wait until our whiskey was absolutely ready. So in the short term, we have a cash flow issue.
Yes.
We've raised all the money to build the distillery and provide some working capital, but to have the patience to wait until your whiskey's ready, it's really useful to have a revenue stream from day one.
And I think, and it's important to clarify that the 3 years and a day is I think it's the 1824 Immature Spirits Act. It's what governs the world of Scotch. And It says that your whiskey or your spirit, because all the distilleries don't produce whiskey, they're ethanol factories, I think is the best way to describe them. And then the ethanol becomes whiskey after 3 years and a day in an oak cask if it's stored and matured in Scotland. What is the difference then between the gin production and the whiskey production? Because obviously the spirit comes off the stills, and then with whiskey, we all know I assume yours goes up to sort of 69%, drop down to 63.5 and goes in wood.
Correct.
But gin, like, what happens there?
So with gin, what we do is we have a very, very high strength, neutral grain spirit, and we reduce that with our own spring water to around 45-50% alcohol. And then we take botanicals and we macerate those botanicals. In our case, it's 9 individual botanicals. Obviously, to be gin, juniper has to be one of them by law. And technically, gin should always taste predominantly of juniper.
Oh, really?
Absolutely, yes, technically. Obviously, you know that there are very, very many gins out there that you'd be really struggling to find the juniper in. But a classic London dry gin style should taste, firstly, of juniper. So we have juniper. We then have ourselves 8 other botanicals, and we macerate those for 24 hours in this spirit in order to imbue it with some element of flavor. But then there's a second stage to the process. We have a copper pot still, and in goes that liquid with the botanicals. And then it goes through another distillation. And from that distillation, like whiskey distillation, you have generally 3 parts to it. There's the heads, the heart, and the tails. The heads and the tails normally get recycled into the next distillation. We don't do that, actually. We actually discard the heads and the tails.
Oh, wow.
I know. We actually lose about 25% of our distillation because we want our gin to be the smoothest gin possible. And so that's one element that makes ours different. And the other point of our gin is that one of our 9 botanicals, which is, I think we were the first to ever do this, we use a seaweed called sugar kelp.
Oh, wow.
It's a beautiful seaweed, and by it, as its name suggests, it's got a sweet, savory element to it, almost like an umami maritime note. And that gives our gin this lovely kind of subtle salinity, a sort of a slight saltiness. It doesn't taste of seaweed, don't get me wrong, but there is something maritime about the gin, and that reflects our island position, if you like. So that's something the island can give us when we're making our gin. So that's gin. It's such a different process to whiskey.
And do you know much about the process of what went into selecting your botanicals? Was that done pre-production, as in the planning stages, or where do you find your magic? Because I think you've won quite a lot of awards for like the gin's really well regarded, isn't it? Like it's won.
Yeah, we were Gin Distillery of the Year in Scotland for 2 successive years, which is unheard of as well. So we've won lots of prizes for our gin and the way it's produced. But the creation of the recipe was actually interesting. We said from the beginning, we have to take what we can from Harris to make this of Harris, whether it's our whiskey or our gin. So we hired an ethnobotanist. So we've got a musicologist founder, we've got an ethnobotanist advisor, and she spent 2 weeks on the island cycling around, doing a study for me in terms of plant life that could give something distinctive to the gin. And she was a wild swimmer, was her hobby.
Oh, wow.
So she was looking under the water as well as on the land and came up with this idea of sugar kelp. And just the name itself resonates really well. And so what we did was we then went to Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh, who have a centre for brewing and distilling. And we got some grant funding, and we had a research scientist worked for 6 months developing our recipe. This is before we'd built the distillery. So this was done, in the laboratory. And what we then had to do was, once we were up and running, transfer that recipe into reality and hope that what had been done on the desk actually worked. And it was a beautiful success from day one. And going back to your point of why the gin when you're making whiskey, yes, delivering cash in revenue in the early days is incredibly helpful. But the other thing it did, it's so important, is it established a reputation. So the gin was so successful. And as you say, it won countless awards for the gin. It won countless awards for the bottle. At the time, that bottle was, revolutionary in the gin category. And there's a lovely story behind that as well.
I was going to say, because the thing that gin people get right, and we'll come on to your whiskey in a moment, is that they like, and I'm fascinated with design and art, and I think you've got two people. You've got master distillers who make great whiskeys, make great gins, and then you've got product designers who make the things in the shop that people interact with, because you can't open these bottles in the supermarket and try it before you buy it. And I think your gin bottle is absolutely gorgeous. Same with the Herrick, your whiskey bottle. You can see that was all considered and part of it. It's not just a standard tall round, is it?
No. And there's a lovely story behind that as well. So even before we'd raised the funds for the distillery, I took on board the founder's vision of how do you capture Harris in a bottle? So the bottle had to be representative of the island. So it had to be beautiful. It had to be stunning. So I went down to London, and there's a wonderful design agency in London called Stranger and Stranger.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they are really, they've got a New York office, California office, as well as London. Still a boutique agency. And I went down to the founder of the agency, who I didn't know. I just knew of him by reputation. And by extraordinary coincidence, his partner comes from the Isle of Lewis.
No way.
So when I said to Ivan, look, I've got absolutely no money, but we've got this incredible idea. We want to resurrect the population of Harris. We want to represent the island in a bottle. We need your help. And he did a very, very sweet deal with us, including a few barrels of whiskey.
Yeah.
And 3 of them flew up to the island. It was a May 2012, I think it was. And they spent 2 days on the island. We walked on the beach at midnight. It was like midnight sun. The weather was glorious. We visited some Harris tweed weavers as well. So that Harris tweed, you'll see that influence in the bottle as well, the patterns. You walk on the beaches and you can see the strata of the sand in the bottles. And they went back to London and designed those. The whiskey bottle and the gin bottle were designed literally 13 years ago.
Wow.
And the gin bottle, of course, saw light of day in 2015 when we opened the distillery. The whiskey bottle just sat on my laptop for the following 7 or 8 years until we thought the whiskey was ready to launch.
Must have been a frustrating wait for that whiskey bottle to come into life.
See it, and I had to just keep it secret for that length of time, and then finally saw the light of day in 2023.
And I think this is the interesting thing with gin, because it's taken a life of its own. And I think it just goes to show that people can take, because it's not cheap, is it? Like we're not talking 15, 20 pounds a bottle. Is it 40, 42 pounds a bottle?
£5, 60, 70 US dollars, 60 US dollars.
And we literally say to people with gin, stick tonic in it. Like there's not many neat gin drinkers out there.
But our Harris gin, have you tried it as a dry martini?
I've not, no.
Oh, it's the best, honestly. Oh. That's how you should really enjoy it. A dirty martini, dry martini, it's perfect.
And this is what I think so great about certain categories, rum, gin, American whiskies. They take cocktails and they take mixing very well, and it makes it much more approachable than just sort of drinking neat, especially sort of like when people try and get into, let's say, an Octomore or something as the first whiskey.
Yeah, as an old-fashioned, is it?
Yeah, and then it's like, and I think that's what's nice, and I think that's what's great about what's being done at Harris is that everything seems to be considered. Nothing seems to be an afterthought. It seems to be there's like this continuity amongst everything, and I think that really shines through. And I think it's a credit to you and the team there that have put everything together, because there's so many brands that seem to be appearing now that want a piece of this market, which admittedly is struggling. You know, like I was looking at Diageo shares this morning; they're down about 45% since 2022. Interest rates, people, they kill consumer spending, and we all spend less. But
it's a tough time. It's a tough time for the industry. People are spending less at the moment, and it'll take a while for that to ease up. I think as the pounds in people's pockets recovers.
And a great time to have. Well, I mean, how long's the Herrick been out now? How long's your whiskey been on market?
So 18 months. 18 months.
18 months, which is phenomenal, really, because you were extremely patient letting it run that long. And
it had to be right. You know, you get one chance to make a first impression.
Yeah.
And it just had to be right from day one. You know, so
I'm a great disbeliever in tasting notes. Like, I gave a paper in Edinburgh a few weeks ago, and in my research, 90% of the population can't taste tasting notes. You know, of that 10% who can, the master blenders of this world, only 10% of them are consistent. So 1% of people in peer-reviewed studies can show that tasting notes work. So to somebody who hasn't tried your whiskey yet, it's called the Herrick, I would call it somewhere between and this is really layperson terms, don't be offended, but I'm trying to make associations out there, somewhere between like a Johnny Walker and a Johnny Walker Black, because it does have that element of peat in there, doesn't it? And maybe like a Highland Park sort of thing.
Yeah, do you know, it's so funny you say that. We said when we went to launch the whiskey that we weren't going to use tasting notes. You know, for exactly that reason. You know, we wanted people to tell us what they thought it tasted like, and also people around the world. You know, your nose. It's all to do with your upbringing and your own experience, and people giving you notes that don't relate to what you know is often very unhelpful. Having said that, it's also difficult because our whiskey is quite a hard thing to define. We set out to create a whiskey that was really complex. You know, we talked about complexity and character. That was the brief at the beginning. And that means it's not the most anything. It's not the peatiest. It's not the most sherried. It's not the sweetest. You know, it really is complex. And yet, if I just had to use one word, I would say ridiculously drinkable.
Okay.
I think that's honestly, and maybe that's just, I don't know, I'm avoiding the question, but it's just ridiculously drinkable.
Because I think that, and this is again like one of the problems that I feel that the industry faces, is that if you walk into Co-op as a wine drinker, 1 is dry, 5 is sweet. I like dry wine, I go and get this. And I think the biggest problem that whiskey faces is that when you walk into a supermarket with single malt, you could be picking up a Lafroig, or you could be picking up a Tamdhu. And they're miles apart. And I think this is why people get stuck in their lanes of enjoying drinking one product and not, or they like Tamdhu and then they accidentally buy a Lafroig, which isn't everybody's cup of tea. No. And this is where I think we almost need some like, I don't know, it's sort of like, it's no harm to say we taste like another one, because I know of course you've got to say you taste completely unique, but then okay, what whiskies, because you're not a heavily peated whiskey, are you? You do have peat in there.
Lightly peated whiskey. And when you taste our whiskey, sometimes you can get the peat, sometimes you can't. Sometimes people get it on the nose and they don't get it on the palate. So there's an element of peated there, but not a great deal.
And that's why I say something like a Johnny Walker Black, because most people wouldn't know that there's peated whiskey in a Johnny Walker Black. No, and I think and of course it's massively more complex than that, but it still has that, you know, you're not a million miles away from being into sort of like a very easy drinking territory there, are you? So
that's right. I mean, we are. I mean, even when we do a heavily peated batch, which we do occasionally, even then, for some reason, because of our process, it's never an in-your-face, you know, chest hair growing, you know, peated malt. It's always got to have a balance with sweetness, a little spiciness.
So does that come in from the wood then? Do you have what's your wood program like? Do you have, is it?
So the Herach is made up of a combination of barrels that used to contain bourbon whiskey from America. They're always the first fill, so they've only just arrived from America, so you're going to get a lot of that sweetness from them, the vanilla extract and a certain element of spiciness. And that's complemented with barrels from Spain, so that used to contain sherry. So as a combination of Oloroso sherry, which has got that winter fruits and nuttiness, and then some, what I call the icing on the cake, which is some Fino sherry. And it's just a small percentage of the recipe, as we call it. But it's that combination of those three different types of cask that makes the Herach.
And this is what I think the real, because so much is said about single casks, but again, single casks are, again, you'd liken to a violin being played. And then what the great art of a master blender is to bring across all of these different casks to build a unified, like, it's like the orchestra, isn't it? And I think, so how hard is it, or what are your batch sizes? Is it because your production's relatively small compared to, like, let's say the big DI shows of the world, isn't it? So
absolutely, and we celebrate the fact that each of our batches is going to be subtly different. Even though we try and create the same recipe, we select the same barrels in the same ratio of a similar age, but each batch is very slightly different from the other. And I think that's great because it just demonstrates we are a small distillery. We've only got what we've got in the warehouse.
And that's it. And I think that's great for consumers because you ain't end up with another reason to go back and buy another bottle. You know what I mean? It's
no harm in that.
No. And right, I'm going to talk about something a bit contentious now, because peated whiskey, I think its lifetime is finite. And so I was an antiques auctioneer for 20 years, and we still do a lot of valuing of antiques and things. And ivory was banned in the UK, so it's now completely illegal to sell any piece of ivory. And the context of that was that it was, to try and stop the poaching in Africa. But it got political because most of you are thinking, oh, of course ivory should be banned. If you've inherited a cutlery service, that service has probably got ivory handles on it. If you've got and maybe again this is first world problems, but if you've got a Victorian chest of drawers or a Victorian tea caddy, there'll be a little piece of ivory around the keyhole because that would be there to protect the mahogany or the timber around it.
Yeah, there you go.
So the sale of that piece of furniture was banned because it contained a piece of thing. Now, if you go down, like using peat is a carbon sink. It's storing all this carbon, and when we dig it up, it releases all that carbon out. I don't think we're there yet, but I feel that if we had some strange climate events, let's say that we see 40 degrees in March in Glasgow, or we start to see heavy taxes on carbon usage on private individuals, I don't think it's far stretched to say that peat could get political and be banned for that reason. And I'll go one step further with this, and you can tell this as I'm passionate about this. Scotch whisky production used to be 1% of peat use. They've banned the use of peat in garden centre compost now, so it's now about 7%. In 2028, the ban on peat's going to extend to horticulture, which means Scotch whisky is going to be using about 40% of all peat. So we've gone, the volume won't have changed. It would have gone from 1% to 40%. Yeah. And it's just the optics. And I just think that it's because it's, and there are alternatives that are coming out there. So, and I don't really know what the question is with this, because but it's like, maybe it's to ask you like how aware you are about because you're very sustainable. All your credentials are extremely sustainable, aren't they, at the distillery?
Yeah.
And yet we use, like, I think the average bottle of peated whiskey is like 15 minutes on a commercial flight. It's worth it.
Okay, really?
Yeah, it's big.
Right. Okay. I mean, you're right. It is potentially contentious. It is, I think, a lot about optics, because the 1% that you mentioned earlier remains the same volume. So it was infinitesimally small amount of peat that was being used for whiskey. And therefore, that remains an infinitesimally small amount of peat that's being used for whiskey. So my understanding from the industry perspective is that that hasn't changed, even though obviously, as you say, the percentage of what's being used has increased. I believe that the industry is looking into alternative uses
Well,
or create alternative ways of creating that same flavor characteristic. A lot of people don't realize that the peaty flavor comes from malting barley. It's interesting how many people I meet who think that the peat comes through the water, but it's all to do with the malting process. So if you could find a way of malting that barley that made a similar flavor, that would be interesting. I mean, obviously we will do what is right for the climate. As an industry, we must do what's right for the climate. From a Harris perspective, I think it will be a shame if we can no longer use peat. With peat, as I said at the beginning of the conversation, we try to take something from Harris in the way we make our products, whether it's the sugar kelp for the gin, or for the whiskey, we have the water, which is the softest of any distillery in Scotland. We have the weather, which is really unique. Climate, we get more rain, we get fabulous wind, we get incredible maturation conditions. And what we can also take, and we do in very small quantities, is Harris peat, and take the Harris peat off to the mainland to be malted. So in the very near future, we will come out with a special product, which was made using island peat from Harris, which is, it's going to be different. And that in a way is quite intriguing as to what peat from different parts of the country.
Yeah, because I think with Highland Parks, you get that sort of like heathery peat, don't you? I think, and then exactly. I mean, a lot of the other bits. I mean, Port Ellen Maltings is a machine and is a beast, isn't it?
Yeah,
but then what you mentioned there, you touched on maturation. Then that's interesting. So do you mature on the island then?
100%.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's very unusual for an island distillery. Most islands
really is. Yeah.
Tanker the spirit off to the mainland because again it's ridiculously expensive to build warehousing on the island, and each warehouse costs us more than £1 million, which is phenomenal, and whereas we could be just renting space in a third party warehouse, but that provenance is so important to us.
And do you go to bottle then on the island? Because there's surely, or do you
bottle on the island as well?
Wow. So the whole process is sort of like start to finish on Harris.
Yeah.
There can't be many distilleries that are like that are on islands. There can't be.
I don't think so. It's okay. I mean, you said the gin's expensive, but you can start to see what it costs us to make this product, trying to do as much as we can on the island.
And this is the thing, and this is why we've started this series up, because you see a product on the shelf, and even with the best marketing team in the world, you can't tell the stories that go into that bottle in a soundbite. You know what I mean? Because there'll be something else that's more important. And then, because is it your 10-year milestone that's coming up? Is it next year?
Yes. Yeah, this September, actually.
Is it this September? Wow.
September, yeah. So that Harris peated product that I mentioned might well be seeing light of day, around that time. But yeah, so yes, it's 10 years, and we set out to create jobs, and we have created more than 20 island jobs in that time, and I guess maybe that's the other piece that we can bring to the party when we're looking at what can the island bring to our product is the people. And when we distill our whiskey, instead of simply using instruments to measure when to move from one element part of the process, we actually use the human touch a lot. So I've got 3 young distillers between the ages of 25 and 28 years old, all of whom have learnt their task, their craft on the island. The head distiller is also an islander. These are all islanders. So there's an island, if you like. I mean, how tangible a difference that makes, I can't tell you.
Yeah.
But the fact we've got island people making island whiskey on the island, maturing it on the island, bottling it on the island, every little element will add something to make us a little bit different.
You come back to the integrity, don't you? Again, it's like it's that start to finish process. Well, why don't you give us some because there's probably no one better suited to answer this then. What is the best way to serve your Isle of Harris gin? What's the perfect pour? I mean, you mentioned like a martini or a dirty martini. What would you say is the perfect?
To be honest, that's it, Mark. It is absolutely, and it has to be a very, very dry martini. It's that one where you hold the bottle of vermouth and you wave it over the glass and point in the direction of Italy, and then the rest of it is ice cold Isle of Harris gin from the freezer. A little twist of Sicilian lemon, maybe white round the top, and that's about it. Now, we do have a special product which is only available in the UK, which is an aromatic water, which is a bottle of distilled sugar kelp, and you can buy it on our online shop and in the distillery, and you can add a few drops of that. So that's the way we would turn that martini into a dirty martini, I guess. Instead of the olive brine that you would traditionally use, we have this a little bit more sugar kelp that we add to the gin.
And then what about the same for the Herrick? Because obviously that's designed to be, well, not designed to be, but most people would straight Glencairn it. But if you wanted to have a bit of fun with it, and if you wanted to be a bit creative, what's the best cocktail for that then? What works best for that?
Do you know what I prefer, actually? It's the whiskey equivalent of the Negroni. So you replace the gin with the whiskey. I think there's a word for it. It's called a boulevardier, I think.
Yes.
You know it?
Yeah.
So you've got your vermouth, your whiskey, and your Campari, and then an piece of orange garnish. And that, as long as you don't, I use a bit more whiskey than I would normally do for a Negroni, which is a third. So I would add a little bit more of the Herach so that it really does shine through. Because what I hate doing is suddenly realizing I've lost the whiskey in the cocktail. But yeah, that would be my favorite if I'm not drinking it neat.
And then I've just realized something that's really interesting, and I should have picked up on this earlier. Your whiskey isn't called the Isle of Harris Distillery 7-year-old. You've gone deliberately down that branded route, haven't you, with the Herrick?
Yes, which is a poison chalice, actually, because creating an unpronounceable name, when you're introducing a new whiskey to the world, it's quite interesting. But the reason we did that is the Herach is a Gaelic word which means a native of Harris. So given the whole purpose of the distillery, which was to create jobs for the people of Harris, it felt appropriate to name the whiskey after somebody from Harris. So the Herach.
And I think I think this is the thing. I think branding is great. And look, Johnny Walker sells 8 bottles a second without mentioning a distillery name on it. I think the branding and Herrick, I've got a big bugbear with names that you can't pronounce, because I think it makes this industry a little bit exclusive, because somebody asks for a Kleinelish or a Glengarioch. You know what I mean? You know it's going to happen. But I think it's very bold, and I love the way that you've gone down that branding route. And I guess the one thing then that remains is, if people want to come and see, if anyone's in the UK, it's 15 hours from London, so don't think you can do this as a day trip. You're situated. I mean, I'll hopefully put some pictures up while we're talking. You're situated right on the waterfront, and are you open? What's your, if people wanted to plan a trip to you, are you open to through the year, or do you have off seasons?
Yes, generally. I mean, to be honest, from October till April, there's barely a person visiting the island. We get very dark winters and very wet, and photographers love it. Photographers come in the winter because that's when the light is at its moodiest. But generally, for the 6 months of spring, summer, we're open. We're open 6 days a week. We'll do tours several times a day. You could do a whiskey tour for the Herach. You could do a gin tour for the gin. You could just come and sit by the peat fire. The fire. So we have a fire burning in the distillery day in, day out. As you walk in, so to make it feel like a real Harris home welcome.
Yeah. And then I assume that there's a good vantage point and a good bar that you can serve that dirty martini to look out over the bay.
Absolutely, we can serve that around the fire, and we'll do music some evenings. We have some local traditional musicians coming in and doing a little ceilidh, So it's a lovely, warm place to come. Very, very welcome. All of our guides are local people, and they all speak the Gaelic as well as the English language, and they'll tell you a lot about the culture and the story behind the distillery. It's not a technical tour. It's very, very much the human touch that we rely on.
Well, all I can say is thank you very much for your time, because this has been wonderful. We've been chatting now 40 minutes and we could go on forever. So I really appreciate you taking the time today. And I'll put some links in the description below where you can go and buy the whiskey, because it's very widely available in the UK, the gin pretty much as well. And I think I looked in America, Liquor Barn have it as well. So you seem
The good news is we've just literally a few weeks ago started our own e-commerce site on the US. So if you go to the distillery website and click on the stockist now or the shop, you can go to the US shop, and then we can deliver to 40 odd states.
So nobody's got an excuse not to go and buy.
No one's got an excuse not to buy it. And remember, you're protecting jobs by buying our products as well as enjoying some delicious spirits.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again for your time, Simon, today. That's been absolutely wonderful.
Thank you, Mark.